Thanks once again for dropping by the channel. If you like the content, if you're new to the channel, please hit subscribe, share the video if you enjoyed it, if you felt it was useful. Now let's get into this. So, this is an interesting one here. I'm going to read this now. Gary Russell Jr. has declared that he and Al Haymon sent an official offer to Terence Crawford, of all people. And this is what Gary Russell has to say. Now take what Gary Russell says with a pinch of salt, because this guy is talented, but he says a lot of BS. He says here, and I quote, "If the fight don't happen, I want everyone to understand it didn't happen because Crawford didn't want the fight. The ball's in your court now. Make something happen." Now that's the words of Gary Russell Jr. saying that him and Al Haymon have launched an official that Gary Russell Jr., the featherweight, have made an official offer, allegedly, according to Gary Russell Jr., allegedly, to Terence Crawford, the WBO welterweight world champion. Super feather, lightweight, light welter, 4 divisions apart. Now you have people who say that jumping up 2 weight divisions to take on someone is too much of a big step. My man here is talking about going up 4 weight divisions to face Terence Crawford, and saying that if Terence Crawford doesn't take the fight, that, you know, it's basically their fault, that they're basically ducking Gary Russell Jr. I mean, I've seen this guy say some strange stuff. He doesn't come across as a particularly likeable person, Gary Russell Jr. I've heard of people say that. I think Terence Crawford even alluded to that Russell Jr. is a bit, you know, of a nuisance. And there was talk a couple of years ago that they had beef. I think, well, they definitely seemed to have beef, but there was talk, was it when they were amateurs or was it when they were both young pros? It might have been when they were amateurs, and they allegedly had, you know, a bit of a tear up. I think it was more like a street fight, and people were saying that Russell Jr. got the better of it and he actually buzzed Terence Crawford. That led a lot of people to suspect that Crawford might be chinny. Now, he's not really shown any chin vulnerabilities, you know, as far as I've seen his pro career. You know, he was buzzed a little bit against that Lithuanian guy, but it was nothing major. But yeah, I just can't get over that. Like, the fact that he's saying that, yeah, they've made an official. I mean, Terence Crawford, who is he fighting? Literally, like, who is he fighting? If he doesn't get a Manny Pacquiao fight, he's got Gary Russell Jr. there. I just can't consider. Gary Russell Jr. is what, 5'4"? He's very small. I just can't conceive of that. And imagine Gary Russell going from featherweight to welterweight to fight Terence Crawford. That is just bizarre. Look, he's saying here that, like, if Crawford doesn't take it, you know, it's his fault, the ball's in his court. Like, I would be amazed. I'd be dumbfounded. I'd be dumbstruck. I would literally have seen it all if they announced the next fight for Gary Russell Jr. Terence Crawford at 147 pounds. I will literally have seen it all, because that ain't gonna happen. I can't. You could say whatever you want to say about Gary Russell Jr.'s deluded. I mean, Lomachenko wouldn't go to 147 to fight Terence Crawford. I remember Bob Arum a couple of years ago saying that it would be suicide putting him in there against Terence Crawford. That was when Terence Crawford was at 140 people, and Lomachenko, I think, was at 130. 2 weight divisions apart, and Bob Arum was saying suicide. You're talking 4 weight divisions apart, and a guy who's lost to Lomachenko, who's not as good as Lomachenko, who has hand trouble. Man, that is definitely BS. I'm calling it right there. I seriously doubt there was an offer sent. Al Haymon was really not like Gary Russell Jr. if he sent an offer over. Seriously, he wants that boy to get knocked out bad, if that's the way it is, because I wouldn't pick him in a month of Sundays over Terence Crawford. Gary Russell Jr. is a good fighter, don't get me wrong. I'm a bit annoyed that he's only been in the ring once a year for the last couple of years, because when he was, you know, fighting regularly, I know he has hand trouble, to be fair, but still, when he was fighting regularly, he was impressive, you know. And his fight against Lomachenko, like, to put that in context, that wasn't a fully developed Lomachenko, but it wasn't a Gary Russell Jr., you know, at the pinnacle of his career either, and he done very well against Lomachenko. I know one judge had it a draw. Lomachenko won the fight clearly, but he never overwhelmed Russell Jr. Russell Jr. held his own in that fight. I think there was a disputed knockdown in that fight. I can't remember what it looked like, but I remember the first time I seen it, it did look like it was a legit knockdown. So Russell Jr. done well against Lomachenko, but mate, he ain't going. That's not that fight with Terence Crawford. Your boy's calling it. That's never going to happen. Never gonna happen. Can't see it. I'd be dumbstruck if it did. But here's a question for people in the comment section. If it did happen, who do you have? Who do you have? Do you have the featherweight champion or the welterweight champion? Let me know your thoughts down below. Just a weird one. Let me know your thoughts down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, of course, people, if you are new to the channel. And as always, I will talk to you.